It was a quiet night, the kind where the air HS with unspoken tension. Mom was in the kitchen humming a tune that didn't quite match the furrow in her brow. I was sprawled on the living room floor, supposedly doing homework, but really just staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. And then there was him. He was in his usual spot on the armchair, the one that seemed to mold itself to his shape over the years. We'd known each other forever, or at least as far back as my memur stretched. He was the steady presence, the one who'd St. St. And when my real dad stepped out, he'd been the one to teach me how to ride a bike, how to throw a baseball, the one who'd walked me down the aisle at every school play, and he'd been the one who tucked me in at night, his hand lingering on my forehead, a silent promise of growth. The TV was playing a cliched romantic comedy that my mom adored, but we weren't really into it. I stole a quick glance in his direction and saw that he was glued to the screen, but his expression was one of disinterest. I had an uneasy sense that something was going to happen, something that would disrupt our cozy world together. A sudden inspiration struck me. I wanted to break the silence and shake things up, but I was too impulsive and giggling to think straight. I leaped onto his lap and yelled, "Come on, Papa, let's find something better than this." My laughter died as soon as I landed, and his hands went to my waist. Instinctively, a reflex he'd likely done 1,000 times before, but this time they lingered just a fraction of a second too long, perhaps, but it was enough. The air crackled between us, thick with unsaid words. I wanted to laugh it off, but his fingers remained still, pressing a silent question mark against my skin. I could feel the tension radiating off of him, a sudden stiffness in his entire body. I tilted my head to meet his eyes, and they were different in some way. This wasn't the warm, familiar look I was used to. This was something else entirely. For what seemed like an eternity, a strange heat bloomed in my chest, a sensation so foreign that it made my stomach clench. I apologize, but I chirped, frantically getting to my feet, and a nervous laugh bubbling as I lay in bed that night. My heart was still racing, and the image of his eyes burned into my memory. I couldn't explain it, but something had changed between us. The rest of the evening went by without incident, or at least without anything noticeable. Mom came in from the kitchen with a bright smile, announced dinner, and we ate, talked, and laughed. But there was still an undercurrent of tension, a quiet hum beneath the surface of our normal life. I relived the scene in my mind, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, that it was just a harmless interaction. But somewhere, an uneasy feeling told me something wasn't right. And that was only the beginning. The following morning, at breakfast, everything seemed normal. My mom was mindlessly chatting about work, and I tried to act normally. But I could feel his eyes on me, a constant awareness that made my skin crawl. He followed suit, or was he just acting? I evaded his gaze, desperately trying to reassure myself that everything was fine and that I was simply exaggerating. But then something else happened. My mom left us alone that evening, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone, when he came over. He hesitated for a moment, his voice casual as if nothing had transpired. "Are you all right?" he inquired, his gaze fixed on me. I stood up, occupied with putting away an errant dish, but as I passed him, I sensed a sharpness in his breath, as if he had taken a sharp breath. An unsettling sensation washed over me. It seemed as if someone was peering down at me, not in an ominous, but observing manner. Whenever I entered a room, I would notice his eyes locking onto mine for an uncomfortable amount of time. No matter what I spoke about, he listened with an unsettling focus. There was a subtle change in the atmosphere between us, a mutual understanding that lies beyond the surface of our regular contacts. I was desperate to find out whether my paranoia was taking over or if I was just hallucinating, so I decided to put myself out there. On the following night, we were alone once again. I purposefully walked closer to him than usual, subtly invading his personal space. As I reached for a fork, our fingers touched, and he lingered on mine for an extra fraction of a second. It was a small, seemingly insignificant gesture, but it conveyed a lot. I realized it wasn't accidental anymore. The tension between us increased, and every glance, touch, and crackle of unspoken words became charged with meaning. The air crackled with a danger undercurrent that thrilled and terrified me. As we watched TV one night, he abruptly turned to me, his eyes fixed on mine. "There's something I need to tell you," he said in a low, serious voice. My heart raced, and I knew this was the moment of truth. His eyes followed my every move, and our hands brushed against each other as we reached for the same thing. It was like a dance, a delicate push and pull that left me holding my breath. I could feel the tension building, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air, and my senses were on high alert. "What is it?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He paused, his gaze flitting away for a moment before coming back to mine. The words hung heavy with unspoken meaning in the air as I held my breath, my mind racing with possibilities. Suddenly, the phone rang, shattering the moment Mom's name flashed across the screen. He sighed, a flicker of frustration showing on his face. He responded to the call, his focus moving away from me, while crossing his face and saying, "I should get that." The time had passed, and the words remained unsaid, but I could feel the knot in my gut as I waited for him to reveal all. Looking back, I regret not avoiding him. I should have pretended everything was fine, that the kiss was just a dream I made up in the middle of the night. Instead, I found myself looking into his eyes, captivated by his light. It was a risky game, a carefree dance on the brink of disaster, and I knew I was going to be burned. He even offered to help me with my schoolwork. As we sat at the kitchen table one evening, our only companions were the sound of our textbooks and papers scattered around the table. His approach, seemingly to examine my notes more closely, actually sent shivers down my spine since his breath caressed my ear. With his palm down on the table, inches from my own, he extended an implicit invitation. I could feel my heart thumping on my ribs, a racing heart that resounded in my ears. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, but I couldn't break free. It was as if I were being pulled out to sea by an irresistible riptide, and he sensed my reluctance, the unspoken question in my eyes. A hint of regret or desire showed on his face, and he murmured something in a low, raspy voice. His eyes were fixed on mine, and I couldn't tell if he was warning me or himself. The air crackled between us, electric, and it made my skin tingle as we sat there in a moment of breathless silence. He only stared at me as I spoke, my voice barely audible, as the weight of the unspoken words hung thick in the air. His eyes betrayed a mix of desire and something sinister, and I felt my stomach knot up as I felt the time drag on in excruciating slow motion, the sound of the clock echoing in the stillness, and the heat radiating off of him drawing me in closer and closer. Then, as if he were about to speak, my mom swung by, her arms laden with grocery bags. Apologies for interrupting, but I was engrossed in gathering my books as he cleared his throat and looked away. Mom didn't seem to notice or acknowledge anything as she began unpacking the groceries while humming a tuneless tune. They seemed oblivious to the tension in the room. Melody, while we sat there, the silence between us thick with unspoken words, the incident left me shaken, my emotions in turmoil. I knew I couldn't continue like this, that I had to put an end to this dangerous game we were playing, but at the same time I couldn't deny the pull I felt towards him, the irresistible attraction that made me crave his touch, his gaze, his presence. I tried to avoid him to create distance between us, but it was like trying to escape my own shadow. Everywhere I went, he was there. A constant reminder of the forbidden desire that burned between us. And then one night it happened again. Mom was working late, and we were alone in the house. I was in the living room trying to concentrate on a book, but my mind kept wandering back to him, to the way his eyes looked at me, to the way his hand lingered on mine. He came into the room, his footsteps silent. He stood there for a moment watching me before walking over to the fireplace. He didn't say anything, just stared into the flames, his face etched in shadows. I watched him, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence stretched out between us, thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of our secret. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes burning with an intensity that made me shiver. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice rough, filled with a desperate longing. "Do what?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Pretend that I don't want you," he said, taking a step closer to me. "Pretend that I don't think about you every minute of every day." My breath hitched. There was an undeniable rush of excitement coursing through me, even though I was afraid of what was to come. He moved closer, his hand reaching out to touch my cheek. The sensation of his fingers brushing against my flesh was electric, and my heart raced with expectation. "I know this is wrong," he whispered in a barely audible voice, "but I find myself unable to resist his allure." Our desires mirrored, our longings met, and the world around us vanished as we were engulfed in the passionate moment. In our relationship, it seemed like fate had other plans for us. It kept drawing us closer and closer, like two magnets drawn by an irresistible force, and I wanted to stop, forget, and erase the memory of his lips on mine, his hands on my skin, and the way my heart pounded against my ribs whenever he was near. While my mom was away at her book club one afternoon, a rare moment of quiet in our normally hectic home, I took extra long showers, hoping the hot water would melt away the stress that felt like a second skin as I dried off with a towel. I approached him in the corridor and stood face to face with him. He was facing away from me, positioned by the linen clothlet. However, as I approached, he glanced down at me, a brief, almost imperceptible glance that set my heart ablaze. I should have walked right by him, pretended not to see him, and attributed my racing heart to nothing more than the residual heat from the shower. Instead, I stood there still, my feet defying my brain's orders. As I spoke in a barely audible whisper, he fixed his gaze on me. I nodded, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions as he finally spoke, his voice a raspy whisper as if he didn't quite believe what he was saying. His eyes were fixed on mine as we had a quiet conversation. He didn't respond right away, and the space between us was thick with unspoken words. His magnetic pull was so strong that I wanted to run away, but I kept my feet firmly planted on the floor. Behind him, his intense gaze followed my every step, amplifying my senses to the fullest. Later that evening, I found him in the living room, staring out the window at the twilight sky. He was silhouetted against the fading light, his profile sharp and defined, a figure that seemed both familiar and foreign. I hesitated at the doorway, not sure whether to approach him. He turned to meet mine, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He didn't say a word, just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Attracted to him in an unseen way, I approached him. We stood in silence, our bodies' language speaking volumes. I eventually spoke up, my voice barely audible as he gave me a disapproving glare. With a low, husky voice, he murmured, "Do what you want me to do?" I responded, my voice quivering slightly, as if we were acting normally. With a stride toward me, he advanced. His fingertips brushed over my skin, sending a bolt of electricity through me. He whispered in a harsh voice filled with desperate need, and my breath hitched as he reached out to touch my cheek. Our connection was abnormal. I felt an overwhelming mix of fear and excitement as I braced myself for what was to come. Despite my fears, I couldn't shake the feeling of excitement, which caused my heart rate to increase. As he drew near, his lips brushing against my ear, he whispered something that made me shiver. "I think about you all the time." His voice sent shivers down my spine every single day, and my heart raced with anticipation. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the magnetic pull he had on me. Eventually, I had to face the music. As I was about to believe we had reached an impasse, all of a sudden, the front door banged shut, and then I heard my mother's voice yelling my name. Frightened, we sprang apart like two lovers caught in the act, the spell broken, and the reality of our predicament engulfed us. As Mom entered the living room, her eyes widened in shock at what she saw. The air was heavy with tension, as if unsaid words were causing us to freeze. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tight and her pupils to widen. Neither of us answered, but we stared at each other intently. Our secret hung heavy in the air, and the only sound was our labored breathing. Then, just when I thought the tension was going to explode, he spoke, his voice composed and a mask of innocence slipping over his features. "We were simply talking about school," he explained, and Mom looked at him. She remained motionless, her eyes darting back and forth between him and me, as if she could read his subtle suspicions. My heart was racing, and my blood was pounding in my ears as the tension in the room grew thicker. Just when I thought I could take it no more, my mom smiled a hesitant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "All right," she said, her voice softening slightly as she wanted to make sure everything was all right. Then she turned and left the room, leaving us alone once more. The tension remained a quiet hum undermining our everyday interactions. We remained silent for a while, the tension from our secret weighing us down, before he finally looked over at me. He murmured something, his voice barely audible, as he looked into my eyes and asked, "What do we do now that they're dead?" I remained silent as my thoughts raced with a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. On one hand, I knew we couldn't keep playing this dangerous game. On the other, I couldn't resist the overwhelming pull of his touch, gaze, and presence. My heart raced as I stared at him, torn between desire and duty, right and wrong. I knew our story was far from over. On the other hand, I couldn't keep it bottled up any longer. The secret was like a living thing inside me, twisting and turning, ready to explode and destroy everything. I needed to confide in someone, to share the burden of this impossible situation. I mustered up the bravery to approach my mom in the kitchen that night after dinner, as the awkward stillness between us hung heavy with unspoken words. She was washing the dishes with her back to me, humming a tuneless melody. As I spoke, my voice quivering slightly, I said, "There's something I need to tell you." She looked up at me, her expression showing a hint of intrigue. In an effort to slow my racing heart, I took a deep breath and hurriedly spoke, "It's about him." I tried to explain what had happened, but my words came out in a jumble and I used hushed tones and veiled allusions just enough for her to grasp the hidden truth beneath our polite exchanges. I filled her in on the details of the aftershocks, the snatched looks, the unsaid tension that hummed like static electricity between us as I awaited her response. I braced myself for a mix of shock, rage, and possibly even denial. I got ready for the impending storm, but all she did was stare at me. I could tell she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper, because her eyes were steadfast and her expression was unreadable. The space between us was filled with unspoken words. I froze, my mind reeling, as she sighed and slumped her shoulders slightly. "I noticed her eyes darting away from you, and I noticed how you changed, how you became more distant and guarded." I didn't say a word, my mind struggling to process her words. She had known all along, seen the signs, and sensed the unspoken tension between us. Instead of facing the truth, she chose to remain silent, choosing to ignore it. When I finally spoke up, my voice filled with a mix of confusion and hurt, I asked. She shrugged, her expression resigned. I didn't want to believe it, she admitted, her voice fairly audible. I cried out in a low voice, accusing her of ignoring the truth, because I was too angry to face it. I felt bitter contempt and fury towards her for denying it and for choosing to ignore it. How could you? Her expressionless face remained frozen on the tabletop as she remained silent. In ear-piercing accusation, she turned and walked out of the room, vanishing down the hallway and into the sanctuary of her bedroom. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of voices downstairs. I could hear my mom talking to someone, her voice low and serious. The moment dragged on, heavy with unspoken words and the weight of our shared secret. I dragged myself out of bed and made my way to the door, my heart weighed down by a mix of grief and relief as I listened to the muted conversation outside. "Below it's for the best," my mom said, her voice quivering a little. I can't have this in my house, I understood. A male voice, both familiar and foreign, replied. It was him. A wave of sadness swept over me, an inexplicable sense of loss. I knew he was leaving, that he was walking out of our lives forever. But part of me couldn't believe it, couldn't quite accept that he was truly gone. I walked downstairs, my heart heavy with a mixture of grief and relief. There, he stood by the door, a suitcase at his feet. His face was etched with as he stepped out of the room, a silent conversation unfolded between us. He didn't say a word, but a subtle nod indicated his intention to leave. We never spoke about it again, but every so often, I'd imagine him, the way his eyes met mine, his hand hovering over mine, and the way our lips met in that forbidden kiss. As the years went by and I grew older, I occasionally wondered what would have happened if circumstances had been different, but those were just passing thoughts. Soft murmurs carrying on the wind reminiscences of an eternal bygone.